I'm Jacob. I live in Baldwin Park, California. That night, I and my two friends Roy and Ethan went to the KFC store in the city to have dinner. At the end of the meal, we didn't want to leave yet, so I invited two of my friends to play Truth or Dare. Ethan and I spun to Truth and told the secret about the girl we were paying attention to. When it was Roy's turn, he turned to Dare. I excitedly stood up and challenged Roy to go out of the store and perform a spell to call out to the devil. Roy is very superstitious of the supernatural beings, so he immediately refused. But Ethan and I were determined not to let Roy go. I tried to force Roy, and in the end he had no other choice but to comply. It was nearly 12 o'clock at night, and there were only us and 3 employees left in the restaurant. Looking through the window, his frightened and trembling appearance made Ethan and I burst out laughing. Ethan and I told each other that this would be an experience for Roy to become braver. But when we looked back through the window, we couldn't see Roy anymore. I told Ethan, "In a few seconds, he will scream loudly and rush in here." But 5 minutes later, Roy still hasn't appeared. Ethan said that Roy was probably trying to lure me and Ethan out there and scare us to startle us. Ethan and I happily held back our laughter and went out. We decided to ruin Roy's joke. But walking around the store still couldn't find Roy. I looked for him in the parking lot, and Ethan ran into the store's restroom to search, but Roy was still nowhere to be found. I called Roy's phone. The other end picked up, but there was a very long silence. I turned off the phone, feeling annoyed with Roy's prank. I pulled Ethan home, ignoring Roy. At that time, I selfishly only thought about my own feelings without thinking about Roy's fear of being forced to do something he was so afraid of. I got home at 2 a.m. and went to sleep. The next morning, Ethan and I went to Roy's house. His sister opened the door and said that Roy didn't come home last night. She called many times, but Roy's phone said he couldn't be reached. Ethan and I looked at each other in surprise. I immediately took the phone and called Roy, and the other end picked up. We happily stared at our phones. I quickly asked where Roy was. He didn't answer. I called Roy many times, but the response was still silence. Feeling that this was serious, my sister Roy and I decided to report it to the police. Police reviewed security cameras at the KFC Baldwin Park store. The image on the camera recorded after performing the demon summoning spell, Roy headed towards the store's parking lot. But when taking image data from the parking lot camera, Roy was nowhere to be seen. Only saw a red shadow passing by while Roy was wearing blue clothes. Continue investigating Roy's disappearance. The police said I should call him so they can trace his location via the phone signal. Once again, this option failed when the police signal tracking system failed to pinpoint his exact position. Where did he end up? That's the question that's always on my mind. It's been a week since Roy went missing, and all police search efforts have come to a dead end. I'm really confused and regretful. I wish I hadn't thought of that stupid game. One evening, I was having a meal in the kitchen when I accidentally looked out the window and suddenly saw Roy. Roy smiled when he knew I saw him. I stood up and called out happily. Roy smiled devilishly, 2 sharp fangs and bloodshot eyes. I was stunned for a few seconds. Looking closely again, Roy returned to his normal state. Rushed out, but Roy had disappeared. Maybe I was wrong. I've been thinking too much about Roy these past few days. It was around 12 o'clock that night that I went to bed. When I was about to lie down, I saw Roy again outside the window with a devilish smile. I was so scared. How could he be there? My room was on the 3rd floor. Getting out of bed, walking towards the window, I slowly put my hand on the handle and opened the window. But there was no one there, just the dark and quiet space of the night. Suddenly, a loud, terrifying laugh rang out, and I turned around in surprise. Immediately, Roy, with wide eyes, wide mouth, bearing 2 sharp fangs, rushed to push me down. I lay in a pool of my own blood, looked up and saw Roy's face gradually turning into Satan's. Roy looked at me and laughed loudly. I screamed loudly and jumped up. The terrible dream I had just made my head hurt. My heart beat so hard it was hard to breathe. Quickly looked towards the window. It had been open for some time. I quickly rushed to close the window and close the curtains. The next morning my body felt like it was drained of all its strength. Lying in bed, I called Ethan. I wanted to tell him about last night's dream. Ethan's mother answered the phone. She was sobbing, her voice distorted. Ethan crashed through the window from the 13th floor of his apartment last night. He was lying in a pool of blood with his body in pieces. I was dumbfounded by what I just heard. I turned around to look at the window. The curtains had been pulled open. On the glass window was printed the left hand with the index finger and little finger pointing up, while the remaining fingers were bent down.